The carriage wheel snapped in half, and the horses screamed into the white nothing of the storm. Alexander Hale felt his body thrown sideways as the carriage tipped and crashed into a snowbank. Pain shot through his shoulder. For a moment, he could not see anything but white, spinning flakes and darkness pressing in from every side. He heard Edmund, his driver, shouting somewhere far off, then nothing but wind. He pushed the door open with his good arm and fell out into snow that reached his knees. The cold hit him like a fist. He had never felt anything like it, not in all his years of comfort inside stone halls and warm carriages. Out here, the world did not care that he was a duke. It did not care about his title, his estates, or the 400 people who worked his land. Out here, he was only a man who might freeze before morning. "Edmund," he shouted, but the wind swallowed his voice whole. He stumbled forward, one hand pressed against the broken carriage, trying to find any sign of his driver or the horses. There was nothing. Only white, only the howling of wind that seemed to come from every direction at once. He had left London 3 days ago to inspect a property near the Northern Hills, a routine trip he had made a dozen times before. He had never expected the sky to turn against him like this. His legs grew heavy. His fingers had gone numb inside his gloves. He knew, with the calm clarity of a man who has read too many accounts of men lost in snow, that if he did not find shelter soon, he would not survive the night. Then he saw it. A single point of orange light, flickering weakly through the storm, perhaps 200 yards ahead. A window, a fire behind glass. He did not think. He simply walked toward it, dragging one foot after the other, until the shape of a small cabin rose out of the white like something conjured from a dream. He reached the door and pounded on it with the last of his strength. Inside, Clara Whitfield heard the sound and froze. She had lived alone at the edge of the northern woods for 3 years, ever since her husband died. And in all that time, no one had ever knocked on her door during a storm. Visitors were rare, even in good weather. She kept an axe by the hearth, not because she expected trouble, but because a woman alone learned to prepare for anything. She picked up the axe now and moved toward the door. "Who is there?" she called, her voice steady, despite the pounding of her heart. "Please," came the answer, muffled by wind and cold. "My carriage has crashed. I will freeze if you do not let me in." She hesitated. A man's voice. Cultured, strained with cold, but not with desperation of the dangerous kind. She thought of leaving him outside, of waiting until morning to see if he was telling the truth. But then she thought of the storm, of how quickly a person could die in weather like this, and she could not make herself do it. She opened the door. The man who stumbled through was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a coat far too fine for the woods. Snow clung to his dark hair and lashes. His face was pale with cold, but even half frozen. He carried himself with a straightness that spoke of a life she did not know. He looked, she thought, like someone who had never once in his life been truly afraid. He was afraid now. "Thank you," he managed, his teeth chattering. "I did not think anyone lived out here." "Few do," Clara said, closing the door quickly against the wind. She set the axe down near the wall, out of easy reach but not out of sight, a reminder, to herself and to him, that she was not defenseless. "Sit by the fire before you lose your fingers." He did as she said, lowering himself onto the wooden bench near the hearth with a grimace of pain. She noticed the way he favored his left shoulder, the stiffness in his movements. "You are hurt," she said. "My carriage rolled. I struck something on the way out." He tried to smile, though it came out more of a wince. "I am Alexander." He did not give a surname, and she did not ask for one. Out here, names carried less weight than they did in the world he had come from. She fetched a cloth and a small jar of salve from a shelf near the window, kneeling beside him without asking permission, and began to examine his shoulder with careful, practiced hands. "You have done this before," he said, watching her work. "My husband was a woodcutter." Accidents happened often. Her voice was flat, giving nothing away, but he noticed the word husband and the way she said it, as though it belonged to a chapter of her life she had already closed. "Was?" he asked, before he could stop himself. "He died 3 winters ago." She did not look up from her work. A tree fell wrong. "I am sorry. You did not know him." She said it without cruelty, only honesty, the kind of directness he was not accustomed to hearing. In his world, people wrapped their words in silk before handing them over. Here, in this small cabin with its single fire and its single window, words came bare and true. She finished tending his shoulder and sat back on her heels, studying him properly for the first time. His clothes were too fine for a traveler, his hands too smooth for a man who worked with them. She had seen men like him before, though never up close, never inside her own home. Men who rode through the village on their way to somewhere grander, who looked at people like her the way one looks at furniture. "What were you doing out here?" she asked. "This road leads nowhere important." "I was traveling to inspect a property," he said carefully. "The storm came faster than I expected." "And your driver?" His jaw tightened. "I do not know. We were separated when the carriage crashed." Clara stood and moved to the window, though there was nothing to see but white. "No one survives long out there tonight. If he found shelter, he is fortunate. If not—" She did not finish the thought. She did not need to. Alexander felt something cold settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the storm. Edmund had served his family for 15 years. If the man had died because of a trip Alexander insisted on making despite warnings of bad weather, he did not know how he would carry that. "We can do nothing until morning," Clara said, turning back to him. "The storm will not let up before then. You should eat something and rest." She moved to a small pot hanging over the fire and ladled a simple stew into a wooden bowl, handing it to him without ceremony. He took it, surprised by how good it smelled, how his stomach ached with sudden hunger. "Thank you," he said again, and meant it more deeply this time. They ate in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them, the wind howling outside like something alive and hungry. Alexander studied the cabin as he ate. It was small but well kept, every object placed with purpose. A woven blanket folded neatly on a narrow bed, herbs hanging from the ceiling beams, a shelf of books, more than he expected to find in a woodcutter's widow's home. "You read," he said, nodding toward the shelf. "Is that surprising?" "No," he said quickly, "only unexpected. Because I live alone in the woods and chop my own firewood." There was an edge in her voice now, sharp but not unkind. "People assume a great many things about a woman who lives as I do. I did not mean to insult you." "I know." She studied him a moment longer. "You are trying very hard to be polite. It does not come naturally to men like you, does it? Being careful with your words around someone who owes you nothing." He almost laughed, startled by how close she had come to the truth. In his world, everyone owed him something: respect, deference, obedience. Here, in this cabin, he was simply a stranger she had chosen to let in from the cold, and she owed him nothing at all. "No," he admitted. "It does not come naturally, but I am trying." Something in her expression softened, just slightly, like the first crack of light through a closed door. "That is more than most men would bother to do." The fire popped and settled. Outside, the wind screamed against the walls, but inside, for the first time since the crash, Alexander felt something like safety. He finished his stew and set the bowl aside, exhaustion pulling at every part of him. "You may sleep near the fire," Clara said, already moving to gather a spare blanket from a chest near the wall. "It is the warmest spot in the cabin. And you?" "I have slept through worse storms than this. Do not concern yourself with me." He wanted to argue, some old instinct of manners rising up in him, but exhaustion and pain won over pride. He lay down near the hearth, the blanket pulled over him, and watched the firelight dance across the ceiling beams. "Clara," he said quietly, testing her name for the first time. "Yes? Thank you, for opening your door tonight." She was quiet for a long moment, standing near the window, watching the storm rage against the glass. "Do not thank me yet," she said finally. "The storm has not finished with either of us." She was right, though neither of them knew it yet. The blizzard outside was only the beginning. What waited in the days ahead, trapped together in this small cabin at the edge of the world, would test them both far more than any storm ever could. Alexander closed his eyes, the warmth of the fire finally reaching his bones, and for the first time in years, he slept without dreaming of duty, or obligation, or the cold weight of a title he had never asked to carry. Outside, the snow kept falling, burying the road, burying the wreckage of his carriage, burying every path that might have led him back to the life he knew before he knocked on Clara Whitfield's door. Clara did not sleep for a long while after he closed his eyes. She sat near the window with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, watching the shape of the stranger breathing steadily by her fire. She had not expected to feel anything but caution toward him, yet something about the way he had thanked her, plainly and without flourish, had unsettled the careful walls she kept around her heart. She thought of her husband, of the years before the accident that took him, of the quiet life they had built together in this same small cabin. She had grown used to solitude since his death, had even come to prefer it in a strange way. Solitude asked nothing of her. It did not require explanations or apologies. It simply existed, steady and undemanding, the way the woods themselves existed. This man asked nothing of her either, not yet. But his presence filled the cabin in a way she had not felt in years. It was not comfortable, exactly. It was something closer to awareness, a sharpening of every sense, as though her body understood something her mind had not yet caught up to. She pushed the thought away and busied herself instead with practical matters, checking that the fire would last the night, that the small window was properly latched against the wind. Tomorrow, if the storm allowed it, she would need to search for his driver. She did not relish the thought of finding a man frozen in the snow, but she could not simply ignore the possibility either. Near midnight, the wind finally began to calm, though snow continued to fall in a steady, silent curtain outside the window. Clara allowed herself to rest at last, settling onto her narrow bed with the axe within easy reach, though some quiet instinct told her she would not need it tonight. Across the room, Alexander stirred once in his sleep, murmuring a name that was not hers, before falling still again. Clara watched him for a moment in the dim firelight, wondering what troubles a man like him carried behind such careful manners, and then she closed her eyes, letting exhaustion carry her into sleep at last. Neither of them could have known, on that first strange night, how deeply the storm outside would come to mirror the one building quietly between them. Morning came gray and silent, the storm reduced to a thin, steady snowfall that showed no sign of ending soon. Alexander woke stiff and sore, his shoulder throbbing with every movement, and for a moment he did not remember where he was. Then he saw the low ceiling beams, the hanging herbs, the small fire that had burned down to embers, and it all came back to him at once. Clara was already awake, standing at the window with her arms crossed, studying the world outside with a troubled expression. "How bad is it?" he asked, pushing himself up from the floor. "Bad enough." She did not turn around. "The road is gone, buried under 3 feet of snow, maybe more. No one is traveling anywhere today." He joined her at the window, careful of his injured shoulder, and saw what she meant. The world outside had transformed overnight into an unbroken sheet of white, the trees bent low under the weight of snow, the sky pressing down gray and heavy as though it might never lift again. "Edmund," he said quietly. "If he found shelter, he will survive." If he did not, Clara let the sentence trail off again, the same way she had the night before. She was not a woman who offered false comfort, and somehow he found himself grateful for that, even as worry gnawed at his chest. "I need to search for him." "You need to eat first and let your shoulder heal enough to be useful." Her tone left no room for argument. A man who collapses in the snow helps no one. He wanted to protest, some old instinct rising up that told him he should be the one making decisions, giving orders, taking action. But he recognized, with a discomfort he did not enjoy, that she was right. He had no idea how to survive in weather like this. She clearly did. They ate a simple breakfast of bread and a hard, sharp cheese, and Clara laid out her plan while they did. She would walk the road as far as she safely could, searching for any sign of the carriage or the missing driver, while Alexander rested his shoulder and kept the fire tended. "I am coming with you," he said. "You will slow me down." "I will manage." She studied him for a long moment, weighing something behind her steady gray eyes. "You are stubborn." "So I have been told." He offered a small, tired smile. "Usually by people who work for me." Something flickered across her face, almost amusement, quickly suppressed. "Fine, but you do exactly as I say out there. This is not your world, Alexander. Out here, pride gets people killed." He nodded, and for once, he meant it without reservation. They bundled themselves against the cold, Clara lending him a heavy coat that had once belonged to her husband, far too large but warm enough to matter. They stepped out into a world so quiet it felt sacred, the only sound the crunch of snow beneath their boots and the distant call of some hidden bird. The walk to the wreckage took nearly an hour, slow and careful over drifts that sometimes reached Clara's waist. Alexander followed her lead, watching how she tested the snow before each step, how she read the shape of the land beneath the white, the way he might read a ledger or a letter. He found himself watching her more than the road ahead, noticing the sureness in her movements, the quiet competence that seemed to come from years of necessity rather than choice. They found the carriage first, tipped on its side and half buried, one wheel shattered exactly as he remembered. There was no sign of the horses, though drag marks in the snow suggested they had broken free and bolted, likely toward the nearest stable they could sense. "Edmund!" Alexander called, his voice cracking with worry and cold. No answer came, only the soft hiss of falling snow. They searched the area carefully, Clara pointing out disturbances in the snow that Alexander would never have noticed on his own, subtle signs of movement, of a person dragging themselves through drifts in search of shelter. She followed the trail with quiet focus, and Alexander followed her, his heart pounding with a fear he had not expected to feel so sharply for a servant, a man he had perhaps taken for granted more than he cared to admit. The trail led them nearly a quarter-mile from the wreckage, to a small hollow beneath a fallen tree, where Edmund lay curled against the cold, barely conscious, his lips tinged blue. "He is alive," Clara said quickly, kneeling beside him and checking his breathing, his pulse. "Barely. We need to get him inside now." What followed was the hardest hour of Alexander's life. Between them, he and Clara half-carried, half-dragged Edmund back through the snow toward the cabin, taking turns bearing his weight, stopping only when absolutely necessary. Alexander's shoulder screamed with pain, but he pushed through it, driven by something fiercer than duty, something that felt, for the first time, entirely personal. They reached the cabin as the gray light of afternoon began to fade, and Clara moved with practiced efficiency, stripping away Edmund's frozen outer layers, wrapping him in blankets, warming water over the fire to bring his body temperature back slowly. "Will he live?" Alexander asked, watching her work, feeling useless despite everything he had done to get the man there. "I do not know," Clara said honestly. "The next few hours will tell us. Frostbite, cold in the lungs. There are many ways the body fails after exposure like this." She glanced at him, seeing the fear plain on his face. "You care for him. Genuinely." "He has served my family for 15 years. I have known him since I was a boy." Alexander sat heavily on the bench near the fire, exhaustion finally catching up to him. "I did not realize how much, until I thought I might lose him." Clara said nothing to that, only continued her careful work, but something in her expression had shifted again. That same small crack of light he had noticed the night before, widening just slightly further. They took turns through the evening watching over Edmund, checking his breathing, keeping the fire fed, waiting for any sign of improvement. Around midnight, the driver's eyes finally fluttered open, confused and weak, but alive. "Your Grace?" he murmured, seeing Alexander's face above him. "Do not speak. Rest," Alexander said, relief flooding through him so completely that his voice broke on the words. Clara, standing nearby, went very still at the title. "Your Grace." She had suspected, from his clothes and his manner, that he was a man of some standing, but she had not let herself consider how high. "Duke." The word settled over her like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything she had allowed herself to feel over the past day. Alexander noticed her stillness and understood immediately what had caused it. He turned to face her fully, bracing for the change he expected to see, the sudden formality, the careful distance people always placed between themselves and his title. "Clara," he said quietly. "You are a duke." It was not a question. "Yes." "You let me speak to you as though you were simply a man who had lost his way in a storm. You had no reason to treat me any differently. I did not want you to." He held her gaze steadily. "Out here, I am simply Alexander. I would like to remain simply Alexander, if you will allow it." She studied him for a long moment, something complicated moving behind her eyes, and then she nodded slowly, though he could see the wariness that had crept back into her posture, the careful distance she had begun to place between them once more. "Get some rest," she said finally, turning back to check on Edmund. "Tomorrow will bring more work, whether you are a duke or not." He watched her move around the small cabin, tending to his injured driver with the same quiet competence she had shown all day, and felt something shift inside his chest, something he did not yet have words for. He had spent his entire life surrounded by people who knew exactly who he was, who treated him accordingly, who wanted things from him because of his title. Clara had opened her door to a stranger in a storm, had risked her own safety to help him search for his driver, had shown him more genuine care in a single day than most people in his own world managed in years, all before she knew he was anything more than a man in need of shelter. He fell asleep that night, thinking of gray eyes and steady hands, wondering what it would mean to be simply Alexander for a little while longer, and dreading, in some quiet corner of his heart, the moment the storm would finally break and the world would come rushing back in to claim him. The next morning brought no change in the weather, only more snow drifting down from a sky the color of old iron. Edmund was stronger, able to sit up and take a little broth, though his hands still bore the pale marks of frostbite along 2 fingers. Clara examined them carefully in the morning light, her brow furrowed with concentration. "You will keep the fingers," she said finally, "but they will ache in cold weather for the rest of your life. Consider it a lesson from the storm." "A cheap price for my life, I think," Edmund said, managing a weak smile. He looked between Clara and Alexander with a curiosity he was too polite to voice directly, though his eyes lingered a moment too long on the easy way they had begun to move around each other in the small space of the cabin. Alexander busied himself with the fire, adding wood, avoiding his driver's knowing gaze. He was not accustomed to being observed so closely, not by a man who had known him since childhood and could read every shift in his mood the way a farmer reads the sky. "You should rest more," Clara told Edmund, settling a blanket more firmly around his shoulders. "Your body has been through a great deal." "Yes, ma'am." Edmund obeyed, though his eyes stayed open a while longer, watching the two of them with quiet interest before sleep finally claimed him again. With Edmund resting, Clara turned her attention to the dwindling supplies in the cabin. 3 people would eat through her winter stores far faster than she alone ever did, and the storm showed no sign of breaking soon enough to resupply. "I need to check my traps," she said, pulling on her coat once more. "There should be rabbit, if I am fortunate, and I have a store of root vegetables buried near the shed that the frost has not yet ruined. Let me help." "Your shoulder is better than yesterday," he said, which was only partly true, but he could not bear the thought of sitting idle while she worked alone in the cold. "I would rather be useful than useless, Clara, please." Something in the way he said her name, simple and direct, without any of the careful formality he had used the day before, made her pause. She nodded finally, and they stepped out together into the hush of the falling snow. The traps yielded 2 rabbits, which Clara handled with brisk efficiency that Alexander found himself admiring despite the grim practicality of the task. She showed him how to dig through the frozen ground near the shed to reach the buried vegetables, and he worked alongside her, his gloved hands growing numb, his breath fogging in the cold air, feeling more genuinely occupied than he had in years of managing estates and attending to matters of business back home. "You are quiet," Clara observed, glancing at him as they worked. "I am thinking. About your driver? About all of this." He gestured vaguely at the cabin, the woods, the endless white stretching in every direction. "I have spent my whole life being told what I am: duke, landowner, heir to a name older than most of the villages on my estate. I have never simply been a man digging in frozen ground, beside someone who does not care about any of that." Clara straightened, studying him with an expression he could not quite read. "And how does it feel, being simply a man?" He considered the question seriously, as though it deserved more than a quick answer. "Frightening," he admitted finally, "and better than I expected." She almost smiled at that, the corner of her mouth lifting before she caught herself and turned back to her work. "Do not grow too fond of it, Alexander. The storm will end eventually. You will return to being a duke, and I will return to being simply a widow in the woods. That is how these things go." "Is it?" he asked quietly, but she did not answer, already moving toward the shed with a basket of vegetables balanced against her hip, and he found himself watching her go, turning her words over in his mind long after they had returned inside to the warmth of the fire. That evening, with Edmund sleeping soundly and the rabbit stew simmering over the hearth, Alexander and Clara sat together in a silence that had grown, somehow, less uncomfortable than the wary quiet of their first night. The fire crackled between them, casting warm light across the small room, and outside the snow kept falling, steady and unhurried, as though the world itself had decided to give them a little more time before demanding they return to the lives waiting beyond the storm. "Tell me something true," Clara said suddenly, breaking the quiet. "Something you would not tell anyone back home." Alexander looked up, surprised by the request. He thought for a long moment, the fire reflecting in his dark eyes. "I am afraid of becoming my father," he said finally. "A man who ruled his estate well, and his own heart not at all. I do not want that life, but I do not know how to want anything else." Clara held his gaze, something soft and unguarded passing between them. "That is a brave thing to admit." "Your turn," he said. "Something true." She was quiet for a while, staring into the fire. "I am afraid I will forget how to want anything at all," she said finally. "It has been easier, these past 3 years, to want nothing. Wanting things means risking losing them again." Neither of them spoke for a long moment after that, the honesty between them settling into the small room like another kind of warmth, one that had nothing to do with the fire at all. 4 days into the storm, the cabin had become a small world unto itself, governed by its own rhythms, its own quiet rituals. Edmund grew stronger each day, though the frost had left a lasting stiffness in his fingers that he bore without complaint. Alexander's shoulder healed steadily under Clara's careful attention, and the wariness that had marked those first hours between host and stranger had softened into something neither of them had a name for yet. It was on the fourth night, with Edmund asleep in the corner and the wind picking up again outside, that Clara finally spoke of her husband. His name was Nathaniel, she said, staring into the fire, her voice low and steady in the way of someone who had rehearsed this story many times in the privacy of her own thoughts, but rarely spoken it aloud. We built this cabin together, board by board, the summer after we married. He wanted to live close to the land, away from the noise of the village. I thought it was foolish at first. I grew to love it as much as he did. Alexander said nothing, only listened, sensing that any interruption might close the door she had only just opened. He was cutting timber for the winter when a tree fell wrong, Clara continued. The men who worked with him said it happened so fast there was nothing anyone could have done. I have told myself that 1,000 times since, and some days I believe it. She paused, her hands folded tightly in her lap. I was 26 years old. I thought my life had ended with his. But it did not, Alexander said quietly. No, it simply became a different life. She finally looked at him, her gray eyes bright with old grief, and something more complicated underneath it. I learned to hunt, to chop wood, to survive winters like this one alone. I built walls, Alexander, careful ones, and I told myself I preferred it that way. Easier to be alone than to lose someone again. And now? She did not answer immediately, and the silence stretched between them, thick with everything neither of them was ready to say. Now there is a duke sleeping by my fire, asking me questions I have not let myself think about in years, she said finally, a faint, rueful smile touching her lips. Alexander felt something tighten in his chest, a mixture of tenderness and something sharper, more urgent. I did not mean to disturb your peace. You did not disturb it, she said. You reminded me it was never really peace at all, only quiet. He wanted to reach for her hand, some instinct rising up strong and immediate, but he held himself back, uncertain of what right he had to offer comfort to a woman who had built her entire life around not needing it from anyone. Instead, he offered something else, the same currency she had given him. My father died when I was 19, he said. I was not ready to be a duke. I am not certain I am ready even now, 7 years later. Every decision I make, every tenant I oversee, every arrangement my mother negotiates on my behalf, I do it all wondering if I am simply performing a role someone else wrote for me before I was born. Arrangement? Clara asked, catching the word. Alexander's jaw tightened slightly. My mother has been negotiating a marriage for me, Lady Charlotte Pembroke, a suitable match, by every measure that matters to my family. Good lineage, good connections, a dowry that would strengthen our northern holdings considerably. Do you love her? I have met her perhaps 6 times in my life. He said it plainly, without bitterness, simply stating a fact he had long ago made peace with, or thought he had. Love was never part of the arrangement. Suitability was. Clara studied him for a long moment. That sounds like a lonely way to build a marriage. It is the way most marriages are built, in my world. He looked at her steadily. Yours was different, I think. Nathaniel and I married because we could not imagine our lives without each other, she said softly. It was not easy. We were poor most years, and there were times I wondered if love alone was enough to survive on. But I never once doubted that he chose me, entirely, without any regard for lineage or dowries or suitability. She paused. I am sorry, for what that must mean is missing from your life. Do not pity me, Alexander said, though there was no sharpness in it, only weariness. I chose this path, or rather, I was born onto it and never found the courage to step off. There is still time, Clara said quietly. Is there? He met her gaze, and something passed between them in that moment, unspoken but unmistakable, a current of understanding that neither of them had expected to find in a small cabin at the edge of a blizzard. The fire popped and settled, and Edmund stirred faintly in his sleep but did not wake. Clara rose after a long moment, moving to check the small stores of food remaining on her shelf, breaking whatever spell had settled over the room. We are running low on supplies, she said, her voice returning to its practical register. If the storm does not ease soon, we will need to ration carefully. Tell me what needs to be done. I will help. You already have, she said, glancing back at him. More than I expected a duke to be capable of. I told you, out here, I am simply Alexander. Simply Alexander, she repeated, testing the phrase again, as though trying to decide whether she believed it. I am not certain that is entirely true, but I appreciate the effort. The following 2 days brought no relief from the storm, and the small cabin's supplies grew thinner with each passing meal. Clara rationed carefully, stretching what remained of the root vegetables and the last of the rabbit meat, while Alexander and Edmund took turns clearing snow from the small woodpile to keep the fire burning steadily. It was during one of these long, quiet stretches, with Edmund resting and the wind howling steadily outside, that Alexander found himself alone with Clara near the hearth, mending a torn seam in his coat with a needle she had lent him, his large hands clumsy with the unfamiliar task. "You are terrible at that," Clara observed, watching him fumble with the thread for the third time. "I have never had reason to learn," he admitted, laughing softly at his own incompetence. "There has always been someone to mend my coats, cook my meals, manage every small necessity of my life." "That sounds exhausting, in its own way." "It is isolating," he said, more honestly than he intended. "I am surrounded by people constantly, and yet I cannot recall the last time someone spoke to me the way you do. Without deference. Without calculation." Clara took the needle from his hands gently, finishing the seam herself with quick, practiced stitches. "Perhaps that is what happens when everyone around you wants something from your title. They forget to see the man underneath it." "And what do you see?" he asked quietly. She paused, her hand stilling over the fabric, and looked up to meet his eyes directly. "I see someone who is trying very hard to become a better man than the life he was given prepared him to be," she said. "I see someone who carried his driver through the snow on an injured shoulder, because he could not bear the thought of losing him. That is not the man I expected to walk through my door 4 nights ago." Alexander felt something crack open in his chest, warm and unfamiliar, and slightly terrifying. "Clara." "Do not," she said softly, though there was no real force behind the word. "Do not say something we cannot take back once this storm ends. You have a life waiting for you, Alexander. A title, an arrangement, responsibilities that will not simply disappear because we shared a difficult week together. And if I do not want to go back to that life unchanged, then that is a conversation for after the snow clears," she said, rising abruptly and moving away from the fire, putting careful distance between them. "Not for tonight." He watched her go, understanding the fear beneath her words even as it frustrated him, and he did not push further, though something had shifted between them that neither storm nor distance would easily undo. He finished mending his coat alone by the dying firelight, his thoughts circling back again and again to gray eyes and steady hands, and a truth he was only beginning to understand, that whatever waited for him back in his own world, he was no longer entirely certain he wanted to return to it unchanged. 2 mornings later, disaster nearly struck. Clara had gone out at first light to check the last of her traps, needing meat badly enough to risk the deep drifts alone while the men still slept. Alexander woke to find her missing, and a cold dread settled into his stomach immediately. He dressed quickly, ignoring the ache in his shoulder, and stepped outside to find her tracks leading toward the tree line. He followed them at a near run, snow flying up around his boots, his heart pounding with a fear sharper than anything he had felt since the night of the crash. The tracks led him deeper into the woods than he expected, winding between snow-heavy pines, and it was the sound that reached him first, a low, guttural growl carried on the cold air. He broke through a stand of trees and found her standing perfectly still, her back against a fallen log, facing a lean gray wolf no more than 10 feet away. Its ribs showed through matted fur, hunger making it bold in a way it would never have been in a kinder winter. Clara held her hunting knife low and ready, but her face was pale, her breath coming fast and shallow. "Do not move suddenly," she said, her voice remarkably steady despite the danger. "It is starving. It may not back down easily." Alexander's mind raced. He had no weapon beyond a short knife of his own, tucked into his boot more from habit than intention. He scanned the ground quickly, and found a heavy fallen branch half buried in snow, close enough to reach without drawing the wolf's attention fully toward him. "Clara," he said quietly, "when I move, run toward the cabin. Do not look back." "Alexander, no." The wolf lunged. Everything happened at once. Alexander swung the branch with every ounce of strength his injured shoulder could manage, catching the animal across its flank as it leapt toward Clara. The impact sent it snarling sideways into the snow, and Clara scrambled back with a sharp cry, her knife slashing instinctively as the wolf twisted and came at her again from a different angle. "Get behind me!" Alexander shouted, positioning himself between Clara and the animal. The branch raised again, his breath tearing ragged in his throat. The wolf circled once, assessing, hunger warring with caution in its yellow eyes, and for a long, terrible moment neither side moved, the only sound the wind hissing through the pines and the ragged breathing of 3 creatures locked in a standoff that could end in blood. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the wolf turned and loped away into the deeper trees, driven off by the size and ferocity of the resistance it had met, disappearing into the white silence, as though it had never been there at all. Clara sagged against the fallen log, her knife hand trembling now that the danger had passed. Alexander dropped the branch and crossed to her immediately, his own hands unsteady as he checked her over for injury, finding none beyond a torn sleeve where the wolf's claws had grazed too close for comfort. "You are not hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with lingering fear. "No," she managed, though her voice shook. "No, I am well, thanks to you." "You should not have come out here alone," he said, more sharply than he intended, fear curdling into something close to anger now that the immediate threat had passed. "If I had not woken when I did. I have hunted these woods alone for 3 years, Alexander. I did not expect." She stopped, pressing a hand to her chest, steadying her breathing. "I did not expect a starving wolf either. You are right. It was a risk I should have weighed more carefully." He pulled her into his arms without thinking, some instinct older than reason taking over, and for a moment she simply let herself be held, her face pressed against his chest, both of them trembling with the aftermath of danger narrowly avoided. Neither spoke. There was nothing that needed saying, only the shared understanding of how close the morning had come to ending in tragedy instead of relief. When they finally separated, Clara wiped her eyes quickly, embarrassed by the show of vulnerability, and busied herself with retrieving the small game she had already collected from her traps before the wolf's arrival. "We should get back," she said, her voice steadier now, though she cast one more wary glance toward the trees where the animal had vanished. "Edmund will worry." They walked back to the cabin in silence, close together, their shoulders occasionally brushing in a way that felt entirely different from the careful distance they had maintained in the days before. Alexander kept glancing at her, checking, reassuring himself she was truly unharmed, and Clara let him, some part of her grateful for the concern even as another part remained wary of how quickly she had come to depend on his presence. Edmund met them at the door, alarm written plainly across his face when he saw the torn sleeve of Clara's coat and the tension still lingering in both their postures. "What happened?" he demanded. "A wolf," Alexander said simply, guiding Clara inside toward the warmth of the fire. "We are both well. Shaken, but well." Edmund's eyes moved between them, taking in far more than the simple explanation offered, and something in his expression suggested he understood exactly how much had shifted between his employer and their reluctant host, even if neither of them had yet found the words to name it themselves. That evening, after Edmund had settled into an early sleep still recovering his strength, Clara sat closer to the fire than she had on any previous night, close enough that her shoulder rested lightly against Alexander's uninjured one. "Thank you," she said quietly, staring into the flames, "for following me, for not hesitating." "I could not have done otherwise," he said simply. "The thought of losing you was unbearable before I even understood why." She turned to look at him then, something raw and unguarded in her expression, the careful walls she had built over 3 years of solitude cracking further still. "Alexander, what is happening between us?" "I do not know," he admitted honestly. "But I know I do not want it to end when the snow finally stops." Clara looked away first, back toward the fire, though she did not shift her shoulder away from his. "You frighten me, Alexander, not because of anything you have done, but because of everything I feel when you are near. I built a quiet life here. Careful, predictable. I do not know how to want more than that without fearing I will lose it all again. I cannot promise you nothing will ever go wrong," he said softly. "No one can promise that. Nathaniel could not have promised it either, and yet you loved him fully, without holding anything back. That is different. Is it?" He turned to face her more directly. "Or is it simply easier to tell yourself that, because the alternative means admitting you are afraid to feel this way again, with anyone, titled or not?" She said nothing for a long moment, her jaw tight, her eyes bright with an emotion she seemed determined not to let fall. "You ask difficult questions for a man who claims to know so little about his own heart. Perhaps being here, with you, is teaching me," he said. "I did not expect a blizzard to show me more about myself than 7 years of managing an estate ever did." Clara allowed herself a small, tired laugh, some of the tension easing from her shoulders. The storm has a strange way of stripping away pretense. Out here, there is no room for performance, only truth. "Then let me offer you truth," Alexander said quietly. "Whatever waits for me beyond this storm, arrangements, expectations, a title I did not choose, none of it matters more to me right now than this, than you. Do not make promises you may not be able to keep once you are back among your own world," Clara warned, though her voice had lost its earlier sharpness, softened now into something closer to hope than fear. I have seen how quickly circumstances can change a person's heart. Then let me prove otherwise, he said. Give me the chance. She did not answer immediately, but she did not pull away either, and in the quiet that followed, filled only with the crackle of the fire and the distant howl of wind against the walls, something unspoken settled between them, fragile and new, like the first thin layer of ice forming over still water, not yet strong enough to bear full weight, but no longer merely open air. The morning after the wolf, something had changed between them, subtle but unmistakable, like a shift in the wind that promised a storm's end even before the sky cleared. Clara found herself watching Alexander differently now, noting the careful way he moved to spare his healing shoulder, the quiet patience he showed with Edmund, the small kindnesses he offered without expectation of anything in return. She had spent 3 years convincing herself she needed no one, and yet here she was, counting the ways this man had already become someone she would miss when the snow finally cleared and the world came rushing back to claim him. Edmund, for his part, had grown strong enough to sit up for longer stretches. His color returned, his appetite hearty despite the dwindling supplies. He watched the two of them with the quiet amusement of a man who had served long enough in his master's household to recognize the signs of something significant taking root, even if neither Alexander nor Clara had spoken the word aloud yet. "You seem lighter today, Your Grace," Edmund observed one afternoon, as Alexander helped Clara sort through the last of the dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams. "Do I?" Alexander asked, though the small smile tugging at his mouth suggested he already knew the answer. "Lighter than I have seen you in years, if I may say so." Edmund's eyes flicked meaningfully toward Clara, who pretended not to notice the exchange, though the faint color rising in her cheeks betrayed her. "It suits you." Alexander said nothing to that, but he did not deny it either, and the comfortable silence that followed spoke louder than any words could have. That evening, with supplies running dangerously low, Clara made a decision she had been turning over in her mind for 2 days. "There is a village 3 miles east," she said, as they gathered near the fire after a thin meal of the last root vegetables. "Small, but it has a general store. If the snow has eased enough on the lower roads, I may be able to reach it tomorrow and bring back proper supplies." "I will come with you," Alexander said immediately. "Your shoulder is healed enough, and Edmund is strong enough now to manage alone for a few hours." He met her gaze steadily. "I am not letting you walk 3 miles through snow alone again, Clara. Not after yesterday." She wanted to argue, some old instinct of independence rising up automatically, but she recognized, with a warmth she was still growing accustomed to, that his insistence came from care rather than any doubt in her capability. She nodded finally, and something settled easily between them, an unspoken partnership neither had anticipated a week ago. They set out early the next morning, the sky showing the first genuine breaks in cloud cover since the storm began, thin shafts of pale sunlight breaking through to glitter across the snow like scattered glass. The walk was slow but manageable, the worst of the drifts having settled somewhat over the previous days, and they moved together with an ease that surprised them both, falling into an easy rhythm of conversation that had nothing to do with survival, and everything to do with simply wanting to know each other better. "Tell me about your childhood," Clara said, as they picked their way along the edge of a frozen stream. Before the title, before all of it. Alexander considered the question, memories surfacing slowly, as though he had not examined them in years. "I remember my mother reading to me by the fire in the library before my father's illness changed everything. I remember wanting to be a naturalist, of all things. I used to collect pressed flowers and insects, much to my father's despair." Clara laughed, genuine and unguarded, a sound Alexander realized he had not heard from her before, bright and warm against the cold morning air. A duke who wanted to study beetles, I would not have guessed. "It seems a lifetime ago," he admitted. "I was expected to give up such foolishness once I understood my responsibilities. My father made certain of that." "That sounds like loss, disguised as duty." "I had not thought of it that way, but perhaps you are right." He glanced at her, something wistful in his expression. "What of you? Before Nathaniel? Before the woods?" "I grew up in a fishing village, further south along the coast," Clara said. "My father taught me to read using old shipping manifests of all things, since we owned little else. I dreamed of traveling, seeing places beyond the harbor, though I never imagined I would end up here instead, in a cabin in the northern woods." "Do you regret it, the life you have built here?" "No," she said, without hesitation. "It has been hard, and lonely, more often than I care to admit, but it is mine. I built it with my own hands, every part of it." She paused, considering her next words carefully. though lately I have begun to wonder if there might be room in it for something more than I originally planned. Alexander's heart quickened at the implication, though he did not push further, sensing the fragility of the moment, the careful vulnerability she was offering him. Instead, he simply reached for her hand, and she let him take it, their gloved fingers intertwining as they continued walking toward the distant smoke rising from the village chimneys. The village itself was small but welcoming, its inhabitants weathering the storm with the practical resilience of people accustomed to harsh northern winters. Clara was greeted warmly by the shopkeeper, an older woman named Margaret who had known her since she first arrived with Nathaniel years before, though the woman's curious glances toward Alexander did not go unnoticed by either of them. "New friend, Clara?" Margaret asked, weighing out flour and dried meat with practiced efficiency. "A traveler," Clara said carefully. "His carriage crashed in the storm." Margaret's eyes lingered on Alexander's fine, if travel-worn coat, and something knowing crossed her weathered face, though she was tactful enough not to press further. "Well, the road south should clear within the week, if the weather holds. Plenty of merchants come through here once the pass is open properly." The mention of the road's clearing sent an unexpected pang through Alexander's chest, a reminder that this strange, suspended time between them could not last indefinitely. He glanced at Clara and saw the same realization flicker across her features before she masked it with practiced composure, turning her attention back to the supplies they needed. They loaded their purchases into a small sled Margaret lent them for the journey back, and the walk to the cabin felt different somehow, weighted now with the knowledge that their time together was finite, that the world beyond the storm was already beginning to stir back into motion. "The roads will clear soon," Clara said quietly, breaking the silence as they crossed back into the deeper woods. "I know. What happens then, Alexander? To us?" He stopped walking, turning to face her fully, the sled's rope still gripped in his gloved hand. "I do not know exactly what happens," he admitted, "but I know I am not willing to simply walk away and pretend none of this mattered. I have spent 7 years living a life that was chosen for me. I am not prepared to lose the one thing that has felt entirely my own choice." Clara's eyes searched his face, looking for any sign of hesitation, any crack in his conviction, and finding none. "Your family expects an arrangement, a suitable marriage. What will they say when a duke returns speaking of a widow in the woods?" "I do not know," he said honestly. "But I intend to find out, rather than let fear decide for me before I have even tried." She did not answer immediately, but she stepped closer, closing the distance between them until they stood only inches apart, her breath visible in the cold air, her gray eyes steady on his. "That is either very brave or very foolish. Perhaps it is both," he said softly, and when he leaned down to close the remaining distance between them, she did not pull away. The kiss was brief, gentle, more a question than a claim, and when he drew back, searching her face for any sign of regret, he found none, only a quiet wonder that mirrored his own. "I did not expect this," Clara admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Any of it. A duke stumbling through my door in a storm, and now this." "Neither did I," Alexander said, his hand still resting gently against her cheek. "I have made a great many careful, calculated decisions in my life, Clara. This is the first thing I have ever wanted simply because it felt true, without any calculation at all." They resumed their walk after a moment, the sled trailing behind them, but everything between them felt different now, lighter somehow, though the weight of what waited beyond the storm had not lessened, only shifted into something they were choosing to face together rather than alone. Back at the cabin, Edmund greeted their return with visible relief, and if he noticed the new ease between his master and their host, the way their hands lingered together a moment too long as they unpacked the supplies, he was tactful enough to say nothing beyond a knowing smile. That evening, as they prepared a proper meal for the first time in days, real bread, dried meat, a small measure of tea that Clara had rationed carefully for a special occasion, the cabin felt less like a shelter from the storm, and more like something else entirely. A home, temporary though it might be. "Margaret will talk," Clara said, as she kneaded dough for the bread, flour dusting her hands and forearms. "By morning, half the village will know a stranger has been staying at my cabin. By next week, the whole county will have heard some version of the story. Does that trouble you?" It did, once. She glanced up at him, something steady and unafraid in her expression now. "I find it troubles me less than it should, given everything else that has happened this week." Alexander crossed to her, taking her flour-dusted hands gently in his own despite the mess. "Let them talk, Clara. I am done living my life according to what others expect of me. I have spent 7 years doing exactly that, and it brought me nothing but a hollow sort of duty. This past week, trapped in a storm with you, has shown me more of what I actually want than 7 years of careful planning ever did." "And what do you want?" she asked quietly. "You," he said simply, without hesitation. "Whatever that means, whatever obstacles stand in the way, I want to find out what a life with you might look like, if you are willing to risk finding out alongside me." Clara's eyes filled with unexpected tears, and she laughed softly, wiping at them with the back of her wrist, leaving a faint smear of flour across her cheek that made Alexander smile despite the seriousness of the moment. "You Duke, you have a way of saying exactly the right thing at exactly the wrong time. My hands are covered in dough." "I do not mind waiting," he said, releasing her hands with a gentle squeeze. "I find I have grown rather fond of patience this week." They finished preparing the meal together, working in comfortable partnership, and later, as they sat around the fire with Edmund sharing stories of Alexander's childhood mischief that made Clara laugh until tears gathered in her eyes again, this time from joy rather than old grief, Alexander found himself memorizing the scene entirely. The warmth of the fire, the sound of her laughter, the easy comfort that had grown between three people thrown together by chance and held there by something that felt, increasingly, like fate. Outside, the wind had finally begun to still, the storm loosening its grip on the world at last, though none of them spoke of what that stillness might mean for the days ahead. For tonight, at least, they allowed themselves simply to exist within the fragile, precious bubble the blizzard had created, unwilling yet to acknowledge how quickly it might all come to an end. Later, when Edmund had drifted off to sleep once more and the fire had burned down to soft embers, Alexander and Clara sat together near the window, watching the clouds thin overhead to reveal, for the first time in nearly a week, a scattering of stars. "It is beautiful," Clara murmured, tilting her head back to take in the sight. "I had almost forgotten what the sky looked like without snow falling through it." "I have never seen stars like this," Alexander admitted. "In the city, the smoke and the lamplight drowned them out almost entirely. I did not realize what I was missing. There is a great deal the city drowns out, I think." Clara turned to look at him, her expression thoughtful in the dim light. "I wonder sometimes if that is why people like you value quiet so highly, once you finally find it. You have spent so long surrounded by noise that silence feels like a gift rather than a burden. You may be right." He reached for her hand again, lacing his fingers through hers. "Whatever happens next, Clara, I want you to know that this week has given me more clarity about my own life than I have had in years. Whatever it costs me to hold on to that clarity once I return to my world, I intend to try." She rested her head against his shoulder, and they sat together in comfortable silence beneath the newly visible stars, neither speaking of the uncertainty waiting just beyond the horizon, content, for now, simply to exist together in the quiet the storm had finally allowed them. The clear sky proved to be the beginning of the end. By morning, the last of the clouds had burned away entirely, leaving behind a sharp, brilliant blue that stretched endlessly over the snow-covered hills. The temperature, while still bitter, had eased enough that the drifts began their slow, steady work of settling and melting at the edges. Clara stood at the window that morning, watching the sunlight glitter across the untouched white world, and felt a hollow ache settle in her chest that had nothing to do with the cold. "The roads will be passable within a day or two," she said, when Alexander joined her at the window, his hand settling naturally at the small of her back now, a gesture that had become familiar over the past days. "I know," he said quietly. Neither of them needed to say more. The unspoken understanding hung between them, heavy and inevitable, the same way the storm clouds had hung over the cabin for the better part of a week. The sound of approaching horses reached them by mid-afternoon, faint at first, then growing steadily louder as riders pushed through the settling snow toward the small clearing where the cabin stood. Alexander's search party had finally located the wreckage of his carriage and followed the tracks leading toward the only shelter for miles. Clara watched from the doorway as 6 riders came into view, led by a stern-faced man in fine winter clothing, who dismounted immediately upon spotting Alexander in the doorway, relief washing visibly across his weathered features. "Your Grace," the man said, bowing formally. "Thank heaven. We feared the worst when the carriage was found abandoned." "Lord Ashcombe," Alexander said, his voice shifting almost imperceptibly into a more formal register, the easy warmth of the past week retreating behind something more practiced and controlled. "My driver and I owe our lives to Mrs. Whitfield's hospitality." Henry Ashcombe, a family friend and trusted advisor Alexander's mother had sent north the moment word of the missing carriage reached the estate, turned his attention to Clara with polite but assessing eyes. the kind of look that catalogued and calculated everything it observed. "We are deeply grateful for your kindness, madam." The Duchess has been beside herself with worry. Clara felt the shift immediately, the way the world outside the cabin came rushing back in with all its titles and formalities and careful hierarchies, and she watched Alexander's posture straighten, his voice smooth into the practiced cadence of a man accustomed to command, and something cold settled into her stomach despite the warmth still radiating from the cabin's fire behind her. "We should prepare to depart within the hour," Ashcombe continued, already directing the other riders toward Edmund, who emerged from the cabin looking healthier than he had in days, though his eyes moved worriedly between Alexander and Clara, sensing the sudden distance opening between them. "The Duchess will want a full account of the accident, and there are matters at the estate requiring your immediate attention, Your Grace. Lady Charlotte's family has sent word twice already, inquiring after your safety." The mention of Lady Charlotte landed like a physical blow, and Clara turned away quickly, retreating into the cabin, under the pretense of gathering Alexander's few belongings, needing a moment away from the sudden crush of his old world, reasserting itself so completely, so quickly, as though the past week had never happened at all. Alexander followed her inside, closing the door behind him to buy them a moment of privacy amid the sudden chaos of his rescue. "Clara, you should go," she said, her voice carefully controlled, folding his mended coat with hands that trembled only slightly. "Your family is worried. There are matters requiring your attention." "That is not what I want to say to you right now." "Then what do you want to say?" she asked, turning to face him, her gray eyes bright with an emotion she was fighting hard to contain. "That none of this changes what I told you last night," he said firmly, closing the distance between them. "That I intend to speak with my mother, to end whatever arrangement exists with Lady Charlotte, and to return here, to you, as soon as matters allow." "Alexander." Her voice broke slightly on his name. "You heard him. Your family expects a suitable match, a duchess who understands your world, who was raised for exactly this life. I am a woodcutter's widow, who chops her own firewood, and hunts for her own meals. I do not belong in the world waiting for you beyond that door. You belong wherever I choose to build my life," he said, taking her hands firmly in his own. "Titles and arrangements are not written in stone, whatever my mother believes. I am the Duke, Clara. I have more say in my own future than 7 years of careful obedience have led me to believe. And if you find, once you are back among your own world, that this past week was simply a beautiful dream born of desperation and isolation, that the reality of choosing me proves far more difficult than the fantasy of it, then I will have learned something important about myself," he said steadily. "But I do not believe that will happen, Clara. What I feel for you did not grow from desperation. It grew from truth, the kind of truth I have been searching for my entire life without realizing it." Outside, Ashcombe's voice called for Alexander with growing urgency, the riders eager to begin the journey back before the light faded entirely. Alexander held Clara's gaze a moment longer, memorizing every detail of her face, before pressing a final, gentle kiss to her forehead. "I will return," he said. "I promise you that." "Promises are easy to make in the warmth of a fire," Clara said softly, though there was no accusation in it, only old fear resurfacing, despite everything the past week had built between them. "They are harder to keep once the world demands otherwise." "Then let me prove I am different from whatever taught you that lesson," he said, and before she could answer, Edmund's voice called from outside, signaling that the riders were ready to depart. The farewell that followed was rushed and public, conducted under the watchful eyes of Ashcombe and the other riders, stripped of the privacy and honesty that had defined every previous moment between them. Alexander mounted the horse offered to him, his shoulders still stiff beneath his borrowed coat, and looked back one final time at Clara standing in the cabin doorway, her arms wrapped tightly around herself against the cold, her expression carefully composed into something unreadable to anyone who had not spent the past week learning to read every subtle shift in her features. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitfield," Ashcombe called formally, "for your hospitality toward His Grace and his driver." Clara offered only a small nod in response, unable to trust her voice with more than that, and watched as the party of riders turned and began the journey south, Alexander glancing back over his shoulder twice before the tree line finally swallowed them from view entirely. The cabin felt unbearably empty once the sound of hoofbeats faded into silence. Clara stood in the doorway for a long while after they had gone, staring at the trampled snow where the horses had stood, at the fading tracks leading away from her small world and back into his vast, complicated one. She moved through the following days in a kind of numb routine, tending the fire, checking her traps, going through the same motions that had sustained her for 3 years before Alexander crashed into her life during the storm. But everything felt different now, quieter, in a way that had nothing to do with peace and everything to do with absence. Margaret visited 3 days after the riders departed, ostensibly to check on supplies but clearly curious about the fate of Clara's mysterious guest, whose true identity had indeed spread through the village exactly as Clara predicted. "A duke," Margaret said, settling into the chair by Clara's fire with barely contained astonishment. "An actual duke, staying in your cabin for a week. The whole county is talking of nothing else. He is gone now," Clara said simply, focusing on the mending in her lap rather than meeting Margaret's curious gaze. "Gone, but perhaps not forgotten, judging by your expression," Margaret observed shrewdly. "There is a look about you, Clara Whitfield, that was not there before that storm." Clara said nothing, though her hands stilled over the fabric, and Margaret, wise enough not to push further, changed the subject to safer village matters, leaving Clara alone with her thoughts once the visit concluded. Each night, Clara found herself glancing toward the door at the smallest sound, some foolish, hopeful part of her heart expecting to hear hoofbeats returning through the snow. Each night she was disappointed, the silence stretching longer and heavier with every passing day, until 2 weeks had gone by without a single word from Alexander, and the fragile hope she had allowed herself to carry began, slowly and painfully, to wither into something closer to resignation. She told herself she had expected this outcome from the beginning, that the honest warnings she had offered him in the cabin had simply proven true faster than she anticipated. A duke's world was vast and demanding, full of obligations and arrangements that did not bend easily for a widow in the woods, regardless of what tender promises had been whispered by firelight during a blizzard that now felt, with each passing day, more and more like a dream she had conjured out of loneliness, rather than a truth she had actually lived. She busied herself instead with the practical demands of her solitary life, chopping wood, checking traps, mending what needed mending, and if her hands sometimes stilled unexpectedly over her work, if her eyes sometimes drifted toward the northern road with a hope she refused to fully acknowledge, she told no one, least of all herself, how deeply Alexander Hale's absence had come to ache within the quiet walls of the home she had built to need no one at all. What Clara could not have known was how fiercely Alexander was fighting his own battle, 3 days' ride south, within the cold, echoing halls of his family estate. He had returned to find his mother, the Dowager Duchess Eleanor, waiting with a mixture of relief and barely suppressed fury, and Lady Charlotte Pembroke's family already pressing for a formal announcement of the engagement, eager to finalize an arrangement they considered long overdue. "You look different," his mother observed, the evening of his return, studying him across the long dining table with the same sharp assessment she had leveled at him his entire life. "What happened to you in that storm, Alexander?" "I nearly died, Mother. And I was saved by a woman who owes this family nothing, who took in a stranger during a blizzard without any thought of reward. A commendable act of charity," his mother said carefully, "which you have doubtless rewarded generously. I intend to reward her with my hand in marriage, if she will have me." The silence that followed was absolute, his mother's face draining of color before flooding back with a fury Alexander had rarely witnessed in his composed, careful mother. "You cannot be serious. A duke, marrying a common woodcutter's widow, found in some remote cabin during a moment of desperation? Have you lost your senses entirely?" "I have found them, Mother, for the first time in 7 years." Alexander kept his voice level, though the effort cost him considerably. "I have spent every year since Father's death doing precisely what was expected of me. I have never once asked myself what I actually wanted, until a storm forced me to stop performing long enough to notice. And Lady Charlotte, her family? The alliance we have spent 2 years carefully building? Lady Charlotte deserves a husband who chooses her fully, not one who settles for her out of obligation. I cannot give her that, and I will not pretend otherwise simply to satisfy an arrangement neither of us ever truly wanted." The following days brought a relentless campaign of pressure from every corner of his life. His mother alternated between cold silence and impassioned pleas, reminding him of duty, of legacy, of the responsibility he owed to a name that stretched back generations before his birth. Lord Ashcombe, ever the practical advisor, laid out the political and financial consequences of breaking an arrangement so publicly understood, the damage it might cause to the Northern holdings, the scandal that would inevitably follow. Lady Charlotte herself, when Alexander finally requested a private audience to explain himself honestly, proved far more understanding than he had dared hope. "I confess I am relieved, in a strange way," she admitted, sitting across from him in her family's drawing room, her expression thoughtful rather than wounded. I have felt for some time that our arrangement was built on convenience rather than any genuine affection. I wish you happiness, Alexander, truly, though I imagine my family will not receive this news so gracefully. Thank you, Charlotte, truly. He meant it deeply, grateful for her grace in a situation that could easily have turned bitter and complicated. Tell me about her, Charlotte said, curiosity softening her composed features. This woman who managed to change a duke's entire understanding of his own life in the span of a single week. Alexander found himself smiling despite the exhaustion of the past day's battles. She is unlike anyone I have ever known. Strong, honest, entirely unimpressed by titles or wealth. She built her own life from nothing after losing her husband, and she showed me more genuine care in 7 days than most people in my own world have managed in years. She sounds formidable. She is, Alexander agreed. And I intend to spend the rest of my life proving myself worthy of her, if she will still have me after all this time apart. The negotiations with Lady Charlotte's family proved difficult, but ultimately manageable, aided considerably by Charlotte's own quiet insistence that the arrangement be dissolved amicably. His mother remained unconvinced for nearly 2 weeks, her disapproval a constant, cold presence throughout the estate, until finally, worn down by her son's unwavering resolve, and perhaps, in some quiet corner of her heart, moved by the genuine change she witnessed in him, she relented enough to allow the matter to rest, though her blessing remained noticeably withheld. I will not pretend to understand this decision, she told him finally, the evening before he intended to depart north once more. But I raised you to think for yourself, whatever else I may have failed to teach you. If this woman has earned such devotion in you, perhaps I owe her the chance to prove herself worthy of this family, difficult as that concession is for me to make. It was not full acceptance, but it was enough, and Alexander departed north 2 weeks after his return, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear that no negotiation with his mother or Lady Charlotte's family had managed to produce. He did not know if Clara would still welcome him after such a lengthy absence, after the silence that had stretched unbroken between them while he fought his battles within the halls of his own world. He could only hope that whatever they had built together during those 7 days trapped by the storm had proven strong enough to survive the weeks of distance that followed, and as his horse carried him steadily north through melting snow and thawing roads, he found himself praying, for the first time in years, that hope alone might prove enough to bring him safely home to her. Edmund rode beside him, his frost-bitten fingers healed enough now to grip the reins comfortably, though he still flexed them occasionally against the lingering ache the cold weather brought. He had watched the entire ordeal unfold at the estate, the arguments, the tension, the slow, hard-won victory over expectation and obligation, and he found himself, more than once, offering quiet encouragement to the man he had served since boyhood. "She will understand, Your Grace," Edmund said, as the northern hills came into view once more, the same hills that had nearly claimed both their lives weeks before. A woman who took in 2 strangers during a blizzard, who fought off a wolf without hesitation, strikes me as someone capable of understanding far more difficult things than a delayed return. I hope you are right, Edmund. I generally am, Your Grace, on matters of the heart if nothing else. Edmund allowed himself a rare, knowing smile. Though I will admit, watching you argue with your mother for 2 straight weeks taught me a great deal about just how deeply this particular matter has taken root in you. Alexander said nothing, only urged his horse forward a little faster, the familiar shape of the northern woods rising up ahead of them, and somewhere within those trees, a small cabin where everything that mattered most to him now waited, uncertain of whether he would ever return at all. The cabin looked exactly as it had the day Alexander first stumbled through its door, snow-dusted and quiet at the edge of the northern woods, though the drifts had shrunk considerably since then, patches of dark earth beginning to show through in places where the sun reached longest. He dismounted at the edge of the clearing, his heart pounding harder than it had during any negotiation with his mother or any confrontation with Lady Charlotte's family. Edmund remained mounted a short distance back, giving him privacy for whatever awaited. Alexander approached the door slowly, memories of that first desperate night crashing over him, the pounding fists, the cold that had nearly claimed him, the wary gray eyes that had opened not just a door but an entirely new understanding of what his life could become. He raised his hand and knocked, softer this time, though his pulse hammered as loudly as it had during the storm. The door opened, and Clara stood before him, thinner than he remembered, shadows beneath her eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, but achingly familiar all the same. Her expression shifted rapidly through shock, disbelief, and something raw and hopeful that she tried, unsuccessfully, to guard against. "Alexander," she breathed, her hand tightening on the doorframe. "I told you I would return," he said softly. "It has been nearly a month." Her voice wavered between accusation and relief. "I had begun to believe." "I know what you must have believed," he said, stepping closer, though he stopped short of crossing into her space uninvited, giving her the choice he had denied her by his long silence. "I am sorry for the wait, Clara, truly, but I needed to make certain that when I returned to you, I returned with nothing left unresolved, no arrangement hanging over us, no obligation I had not properly ended." Clara's eyes widened slightly. "Lady Charlotte? The engagement is dissolved by mutual agreement and, I believe, genuine relief on both sides. My mother knows everything, including my intentions toward you. It was not easily won, but it is settled." "Settled," Clara repeated, as though testing whether the word could truly mean what she hoped. "And what exactly are your intentions, Alexander?" He closed the remaining distance between them then, taking her hands in his own, the same gesture that had become so familiar during their week together, though now it carried the weight of a month's separation and everything he had fought to make possible. "I intend to marry you, Clara Whitfield," he said, his voice steady, despite the vulnerability trembling beneath it. "If you will still have me, after making you wait so long, after everything uncertain I put you through with my silence." Tears gathered in Clara's eyes, spilling over before she could stop them, though her expression held nothing but overwhelming relief and joy beneath the emotion. "You could have sent word, Alexander, a letter, anything, to ease the waiting." "I know," he admitted, "and I have regretted that choice every single day since I left. I told myself I wanted to arrive with everything resolved, with nothing left to complicate a promise I intended to keep fully, but I see now that my silence caused you pain I never intended, and for that, I am truly sorry. I nearly convinced myself you would not return at all," Clara admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "That, the week we shared, was simply a fleeting escape from your real life, one you would eventually forget once the demands of your world reasserted themselves fully." "I could never forget you," Alexander said fiercely, pulling her closer. "Not for a single day, Clara. You are not an escape from my life. You are the truest part of it, the only part I have ever chosen entirely for myself, without any obligation dictating the choice." Clara searched his face for a long moment, looking for any trace of doubt, any hesitation, and found instead only steady, unwavering conviction. Whatever fear had built during the long weeks of silence finally began to crack and crumble beneath the weight of his return, his explanation, his unmistakable devotion standing before her in the melting snow. "Yes," she said finally, the single word carrying the full weight of everything she had been afraid to hope for. "Yes, Alexander, I will marry you." The kiss that followed held none of the careful hesitation of their first, weeks earlier by the frozen stream. This one was certain, full of relief and joy, and every emotion they had both been forced to carry alone during the weeks of separation, finally released and shared freely between them. Edmund, watching from a respectful distance, allowed himself a broad smile before dismounting fully and beginning the practical work of unloading the small collection of gifts Alexander had brought north with him, tokens meant to ease Clara's transition into a world so different from the quiet solitude she had built for herself. When they finally separated, Clara wiped at her eyes, laughing through the remaining tears, and studied Alexander with newfound wonder. "A duchess," she said, testing the word with evident disbelief. "I chop my own firewood, Alexander. I hunt my own meals. I have no idea how to manage an estate, or host a formal dinner, or navigate whatever complicated rules govern your world. You will learn, if you wish to," he said gently, "or we will build something different entirely. A life that suits us both rather than simply following rules established by people who never once considered someone like you might become a duchess. I have spent enough of my life following rigid expectation. I do not intend to force the same constraints onto our marriage. Your mother? Will need time," Alexander admitted honestly. "But she has agreed to give you that chance, Clara, to prove yourself in whatever way feels true to who you are, rather than forcing you into a mold that was never built to fit you. I promise you, I will stand beside you through whatever adjustment that requires, however long it takes." Clara considered this, looking around at the small cabin behind her, the home she had built with her own hands after losing everything once before, and felt, for the first time since Alexander's departure, a genuine sense of hope rather than fear about what waited ahead. "I will need time as well," she said finally, "to close things properly here, to say goodbye to the life I built, even as I welcome the one waiting for me." "Take whatever time you need," Alexander said. "I am not going anywhere, Clara, not again. Whatever adjustments this new life requires of both of us, We will face them together, exactly as we faced that storm. In the weeks that followed, Clara traveled south to the Hale estate for the first time, a journey that filled her with more apprehension than the wolf in the snow ever had. The grand stone halls, the rows of watchful staff, the weight of portraits depicting generations of Hale ancestors staring down from every wall, all of it pressed upon her with an intensity that made her long, more than once, for the simple quiet of her cabin. The estate staff proved polite but distant at first, uncertain how to treat a future duchess who arrived with rough, work-worn hands, and no knowledge of which fork belonged to which course at dinner. Clara caught the whispered comments in hallways, the doubtful glances exchanged when they believed she was not watching, and though she bore it with the same quiet dignity that had carried her through 3 years of solitude, the strain of constant scrutiny wore at her more than she admitted even to Alexander. The true test came nearly 6 weeks into her stay, when a sudden fever swept through the estate's servant quarters, striking down nearly a dozen staff members within a single night, including the housekeeper who had managed the estate's daily operations for over 20 years. Panic spread quickly among the remaining staff, uncertain how to proceed without clear direction, while the estate's physician, summoned from the nearest town, found himself overwhelmed by the sheer number of patients requiring care. Clara did not hesitate. Drawing on years of self-sufficient living, of tending wounds and illnesses without the luxury of easy medical help, she organized the remaining healthy staff into careful shifts, brewed the same herbal remedies she had used countless times in her own cabin to ease fever and cough, and worked alongside the physician through 3 exhausting days and nights, nursing the sick back toward health with a competence that silenced every doubtful whisper that had followed her arrival. "I did not expect this from you," the physician admitted, on the 3rd night, watching Clara change a fevered kitchen maid's cooling cloth with practiced, gentle hands. "Forgive my presumption, but a woman of your background, marrying into such a position, one does not typically expect such genuine skill." "A woman of my background learns skills that matter, doctor, rather than skills that merely impress," Clara said, without rancor, continuing her work without pause. "Necessity is a far better teacher than tradition, in my experience." By the 4th day, every stricken member of the staff had begun to recover, and the whispered doubts that had followed Clara through the estate's halls transformed, almost overnight, into something closer to genuine respect and gratitude. The housekeeper, recovering slowly in her own quarters, wept when she learned it was the future duchess herself who had organized her care and nursed her through the worst of the fever. Alexander, who had been away addressing matters on the estate's northern boundary when the illness struck, returned to find Clara exhausted but radiant, the estate humming with a newfound warmth toward her that had been notably absent upon her arrival. "I heard what you did," he said, finding her finally resting in the estate's smaller drawing room, her eyes heavy with days of insufficient sleep. "The entire staff speaks of nothing else." "I did only what needed doing," Clara said simply, though a small, tired smile touched her lips at his evident pride. "The same as I would have done in my own cabin, for anyone in need. That is precisely why they love you already, Clara. You did not simply arrive expecting deference because of a title you have not even claimed yet. You earned their respect through genuine care, exactly as you earned mine." His mother, informed of the crisis and Clara's role in resolving it, arrived at the estate 2 days later with an expression Clara had not previously seen upon the Dowager Duchess's composed features, something approaching genuine warmth. "I underestimated you," Eleanor admitted, finding Clara alone in the estate's small library, still catching up on the rest the crisis had denied her. "I assumed, wrongly, that a woman raised outside our world would struggle to find her place within it. I did not account for the possibility that our world might benefit considerably from someone raised outside its more rigid expectations. I do not intend to abandon who I am, Your Grace, simply to fit more comfortably into this life," Clara said carefully, unsure how far such honesty might be welcomed. "No," Eleanor agreed, something almost like approval coloring her tone. "I begin to suspect that is precisely why my son loves you so completely. Perhaps it is time this family welcomed a little of that outside perspective, rather than continuing to guard so fiercely against it." 3 months later, in a ceremony far smaller and simpler than tradition dictated for a duke's wedding, much to the Dowager Duchess's continued but softening disapproval, Alexander Hale and Clara Whitfield were married, in the small northern village where Clara had built her quiet life, surrounded by villagers who had known her for years and a small handful of estate staff who had come to witness their duke's unconventional but undeniable happiness. Margaret cried through the entire ceremony, insisting loudly to anyone who would listen that she had known from the very first moment Clara mentioned her mysterious traveler that something significant was unfolding. Edmund stood as Alexander's witness, his weathered face beaming with a pride and satisfaction that came from having watched the entire improbable story unfold from its very first desperate knock upon a cabin door. Even the Dowager Duchess, standing stiffly at the edge of the small gathering, found herself unable to maintain full disapproval by the ceremony's end, watching her son's face as he looked at his new wife, an expression of complete, unguarded happiness she had not witnessed in him since long before his father's death had forced premature responsibility onto young shoulders. "You were right," Eleanor admitted quietly to Clara, after the ceremony concluded, surprising them both with the gesture, "about what my son needed, though I confess it took me considerably longer to understand it than it apparently took you. I did not choose this for him, Your Grace," Clara said carefully. "He chose it entirely for himself." "Perhaps," Eleanor allowed, studying the younger woman with something approaching respect, "but you gave him the space to make that choice honestly, rather than according to expectation. That is no small gift, whatever your background." Clara and Alexander did not fully abandon the cabin in the northern woods, choosing instead to return there often throughout the following years, a private refuge from the demands of estate life, the place where their unlikely story had first begun during a blizzard that neither of them could have predicted would reshape their entire futures. Years later, when their own children asked how their parents had met, Alexander would tell the story exactly as it happened: the crashed carriage, the desperate knock upon a stranger's door, the wary widow who nearly turned him away, before her own compassion won out against caution. "Your mother saved my life that night," he would tell them, Clara smiling quietly beside him, as she listened to a story she had heard countless times, but never tired of hearing, not just from the storm outside, but from a life I had never truly chosen for myself. "She showed me what it meant to be simply a man, valued for who I was rather than what I possessed, and I have spent every day since trying to prove myself worthy of that gift. And your father saved me as well," Clara would add, taking his hand across whatever table or hearth had gathered their family together. "From a solitude I had convinced myself I preferred, from a fear of losing love again that had kept my heart carefully guarded for far too long, we saved each other, in the end, though neither of us realized that was what the storm intended all along." Outside, whatever season had brought them together to tell the story once more, snow or summer sun, the cabin stood as it always had, weathered but sturdy, a quiet testament to the truth that some of life's most significant transformations arrive not through careful planning or calculated arrangement, but through the unexpected mercy of a single knock upon a stranger's door, and the courage it takes to answer honestly, regardless of what the world outside might demand. Edmund remained in Alexander's service for many years afterward, eventually training a younger driver to take his place while he settled into a comfortable role managing the estate's stables, a position he claimed suited his aching fingers far better than long hours gripping cold reins. He never tired of retelling the story of that fateful storm to anyone who would listen, embellishing certain details with each passing year, though the heart of the tale, a duke who nearly lost everything to save what truly mattered, remained faithfully unchanged. The Dowager Duchess, in time, grew to treasure Clara as genuinely as she had once opposed her, particularly after the arrival of her first grandchild, a daughter with her father's dark eyes and her mother's steady, unflinching gaze upon the world. Eleanor often remarked, in later years, that she had never expected to owe her family's continued happiness to a chance blizzard and a stranger's desperate knock upon a cabin door, yet she found herself grateful for it nonetheless, however unconventional its beginning had been. Clara never fully abandoned the skills that had sustained her through her years of solitude. She continued to tend a small garden near the estate's edge, taught her children to recognize which herbs eased fever and which roots could sustain a family through hard winters, and insisted, despite considerable protest from the estate's staff, on chopping her own kindling each morning, a small ritual that kept her grounded in the woman she had been before the storm changed everything. Alexander, for his part, never forgot the lesson that single week had taught him, that duty and genuine happiness were not always opposing forces, that a life built on honest choice rather than rigid expectation could prove far richer than anything careful arrangement might have offered instead. He governed his estate with a fairness and warmth his tenants had rarely witnessed under his father's more distant rule, often citing Clara's quiet wisdom as the source of decisions that improved countless lives across his northern holdings. And on quiet winter evenings, when snow began to fall once more across the northern hills, Alexander and Clara often found themselves returning to the small cabin where it had all begun, sitting together by the same hearth that had first warmed a desperate stranger on the worst night of his life, grateful beyond measure for the storm that had, against every reasonable expectation, delivered them both exactly where they were always meant to be. 10 years passed, and the cabin in the northern woods remained standing, weathered by countless winters but sturdy still, exactly as Nathaniel had built it decades before, exactly as Clara had maintained it through every season of her life since. Alexander and Clara returned each winter without fail, bringing their 3 children along as the years advanced, teaching them to recognize the same landmarks that had once guided a desperate duke through a blinding storm toward salvation he never expected to find. Their eldest daughter, Rosalind, possessed her mother's steady gray eyes and an equally stubborn determination to learn every skill Clara had once relied upon for survival. By the age of 8, she could identify a dozen different herbs by scent alone and had begged, more than once, to accompany her mother when checking the old trap lines that still ran through the surrounding woods, more out of tradition now than necessity. "Tell us the story again," Rosalind demanded one snowy evening, curled beside her younger brother Edward near the same hearth where their parents had first spoken honestly to one another so many years before, about the wolf and the storm, and how father nearly froze before finding this cabin. Alexander exchanged a warm glance with Clara, who smiled and set aside the mending in her lap, settling more comfortably into her chair by the fire. Though they had told this story countless times over the years, neither of them ever tired of revisiting it, of remembering the desperate uncertainty of that first night, and the extraordinary path it had opened before them both. "Your father arrived at this very door, half frozen, pounding as though his life depended on it," Clara began, her voice taking on the familiar rhythm of a tale well loved. "Which in truth it did. I nearly did not let him in, you know. A woman alone learns to be cautious of strangers, especially during a storm fierce enough to hide any manner of danger behind its howling winds. But you did let him in," young Edward said, though he had heard this part countless times before, his eyes still wide with anticipation, as though hearing it fresh. "I did," Clara agreed. "Some instinct told me his need was genuine, even through the fear that told me otherwise. I have never regretted that choice, not once, in all the years since." "And then the wolf came," Rosalind prompted eagerly, always eager to reach the part of the story that thrilled her most. Alexander laughed softly, remembering the sharp, cold terror of that morning, the desperate sprint through snow-heavy pines toward the sound of danger. Your mother had gone to check her traps alone, thinking herself capable of managing any difficulty the woods might present. She generally was, though on that particular morning, a starving wolf proved a fiercer challenge than either of us anticipated. "Were you scared, Father?" Edward asked, as he always did, needing this particular reassurance each time the story unfolded. "Terrified," Alexander admitted honestly, never one to diminish the truth for the sake of appearing braver than he had actually been. "I had never fought anything more dangerous than a difficult negotiation in my life before that morning. But the thought of losing your mother frightened me more than any wolf ever could." Clara reached across the space between their chairs to take his hand, an easy, familiar gesture worn smooth by a decade of shared life. "He saved me that morning, exactly as I had saved him during the storm. We have been saving each other ever since, in ways large and small." Their youngest, a boy named William, only recently old enough to sit quietly through the entire tale without growing restless, tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Did grandmother truly not want you to marry father?" Clara's expression softened with old memory, some of it bittersweet, most of it warm with the knowledge of how thoroughly that early tension had eventually resolved. "Your grandmother worried, at first, that I would not understand her world, that I might struggle to become the kind of duchess she believed the family required. It took time and patience from us both before she came to see things differently. She loves you now," Rosalind said with the simple confidence of a child who had only ever known her grandmother's genuine affection toward her mother. "She does," Clara agreed, smiling, though it took a rather difficult illness sweeping through the estate, and considerably more stubbornness on my part than I care to admit, before she truly believed it possible. Alexander rose to add another log to the fire, watching the flames catch and grow, his mind drifting briefly to that very first night, to the desperate cold and the unexpected warmth of Clara's small cabin, to every choice that had followed from that single moment of mercy extended toward a stranger. He thought of the arguments with his mother, the difficult conversations with Lady Charlotte, the weeks of uncertain silence that had nearly convinced Clara he would never return at all. Every difficulty, every obstacle, had led inevitably toward this quiet evening, this fire, this family gathered together in the very cabin where their story had first begun. "Do you regret any of it?" Clara asked quietly, once the children had finally settled into sleepy silence, their small forms curled beneath blankets near the hearth. "The scandal, the difficulty with your mother, everything you sacrificed to choose this life instead of the one expected of you." Alexander considered the question seriously, as he always did when Clara asked something requiring genuine reflection rather than easy reassurance. Not for a single moment, he said finally. I spent 7 years believing duty and happiness could never coexist, that choosing one meant sacrificing the other entirely. You taught me otherwise, Clara, more thoroughly than I ever expected possible. You taught me something as well, she said softly, moving to sit beside him near the fire, resting her head against his shoulder in a gesture as familiar now as breathing. That love does not require abandoning the life I built for myself, only expanding it to include someone worth the risk of losing everything again. And have I proven worth that risk? He asked, though he knew her answer already, had known it for years. Through every difficulty and joy their marriage had brought them both. Every single day, Clara said, turning to press a gentle kiss against his cheek, though I confess, some days more thrillingly than others, particularly whenever our children insist upon hearing that story of the wolf, retold in vivid and increasingly exaggerated detail. They sat together in comfortable silence as the fire burned low, the same fire that had first warmed a desperate stranger a decade before, the same hearth that had witnessed careful confessions, difficult truths, and the slow, unexpected blossoming of love neither of them had anticipated finding again. Outside, snow continued falling softly across the northern hills, patient and eternal, indifferent to the passage of years yet forever marking the place where one particular storm had changed 2 lives completely. In the morning, as pale winter light filtered through the small cabin windows, Clara woke early, as she always did, and stepped outside to breathe the crisp, familiar air of the woods that had sheltered her through so many seasons of both sorrow and joy. She thought, as she often did during these quiet morning moments, of the woman she had been before that storm, guarded and solitary, convinced she required nothing beyond her own careful independence to survive. That woman had been wrong, though understandably so, shaped by loss into believing solitude was safer than risking her heart again. Clara did not regret the years of independence that had taught her resilience, had given her skills and strength that continued to serve her family well even now, within the grander world she had married into. But she was endlessly grateful, each morning she woke beside Alexander, that a desperate stranger's knock upon her door had shown her a truth she might otherwise never have discovered, that love, chosen freely and honestly, could prove stronger than any storm, any obligation, any fear that once convinced her happiness belonged only to the life she had already lost. Alexander joined her outside a few minutes later, wrapping a warm blanket around her shoulders against the morning chill, and together they watched the sun rise slowly over the same snow-covered hills that had once nearly claimed his life, now simply another beautiful morning in the life they had built together, one honest choice at a time, far from the arrangements and expectations that had once threatened to define them both entirely. Another year, Clara said softly, watching the light spread gradually across the frozen landscape. Another winter survived, together. Every year with you feels like survival worth celebrating, Alexander said, pulling her closer against the cold. Though I confess, I have grown rather fond of these particular storms, difficult as that first one proved to be. Clara laughed, the sound carrying clear and warm across the quiet clearing, and leaned into his embrace, grateful beyond measure for the blizzard that had delivered, against every reasonable expectation, exactly the life she never knew she needed, until a duke who never meant to fall in love came stumbling through her door one desperate winter night, and changed absolutely everything that followed. Later that same morning, as the children woke and the small cabin filled once more with laughter and the comfortable chaos of a family beginning its day, Margaret arrived unannounced, as she often did during their winter visits, carrying a basket of fresh bread and the latest news from the village that had watched Clara's story unfold from its very beginning. "You are looking well, Duchess," Margaret said, though the old teasing affection in her voice remained entirely unchanged by Clara's elevated title, exactly as it had been when she was simply the quiet widow who lived at the edge of the woods. "The whole village still speaks of it, you know, whenever a new storm rolls through. They say if a duke could find his way to happiness through Clara Whitfield's door, perhaps miracles are more common than anyone previously believed." "I hardly think it was a miracle," Clara said, smiling as she accepted the basket. "Only 2 stubborn people finally recognizing what mattered most, once circumstance forced them to stop pretending otherwise." "Call it what you like," Margaret said, settling into her usual chair by the fire with the easy familiarity of decades of friendship. "The children certainly seem to think it miracle enough, judging by how often I hear that story repeated whenever I pass by the schoolhouse." Rosalind, overhearing this exchange, looked up eagerly from the corner where she had been helping her younger brother lace his boots. They tell our story at school? Indeed they do, Margaret confirmed, delighted by the girl's evident pride, though I suspect the wolf grows larger and fiercer with every retelling, much like your father's account of that fateful morning. Alexander, entering from checking the horses, caught the tail end of this conversation and laughed warmly. I have heard several versions myself, during my visits to the northern tenants. In one telling, I believe I fought off no fewer than 3 wolves single-handedly, which I assure you is considerably more heroic than the truth allows. The truth needs no exaggeration, Clara said, catching his eye with the same warmth that had defined every year of their marriage since that first difficult, uncertain winter. 2 frightened people, doing what needed doing to protect what mattered. That has always been enough, without any embellishment required. The morning continued in comfortable warmth, Margaret sharing village gossip while the children finished their breakfast, Alexander tending the fire with the same careful attention he had once shown as an injured, uncertain stranger learning skills he had never before needed. Outside, the sun climbed higher over the snow-covered hills, promising a clear, bright day ahead, perfect for the kind of quiet family adventure that had become tradition during their winter visits to the cabin. By afternoon, the entire family had bundled against the cold to walk the familiar path toward the frozen stream where Alexander and Clara had once shared their first true conversation about childhood dreams and buried griefs, a path the children now knew as well as their own home, worn smooth by a decade of returning each winter to honor the place where their parents' unlikely love had first taken root. Standing together at the edge of the stream, watching their children chase each other across the snow with the boundless energy only childhood provided, Alexander wrapped his arm around Clara's shoulders and pulled her close against the cold. Happy? He asked, though he already knew the answer, had known it every day for a decade now. Endlessly, Clara answered, resting her head against him as she had done 10 years before, in a cabin transformed forever by one unexpected knock upon a door during the worst storm either of them had ever survived, and the best decision either of them had ever made.